Good evening, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I ran for president on the Green Party line in 2020. With me is Angela Walker, my vice presidential running mate. And we're here for another question and answer session after we share some thoughts about what's going on. First thing is HR 1, which is called For the People Act. And it has a lot of good reforms in it that secure voting rights and make the voting equipment and transparency better. And it's really needed in that regard because we now have over 250 bills that Republicans have put into state legislatures to restrict voting rights. And because they control 30 state governments, a lot of these restrictions are going to pass in states like Georgia, where because voting rights were protected more than in the past, there was a different outcome and the Republicans were on the losing end. So their strategy is to deny, particularly Black folks, the right to vote. So this bill is important. The problem is there's a campaign finance section that raises 5 times the threshold for a group like the Green Party to qualify for primary matching funds. And that's really the least of the problems because they set up this matching fund system where you get a 6-to-1 match on small donations, which really increases the disparities between candidates 7 times. Imagine you raise $1 million that can be matched. So you get 7 million. Imagine you raise 5 million, another candidate, that gets matched to 35 million. So the difference goes from 4 million to, what is it? 35 minus 7 is 28 million. From 4 million to 28 million, which means the disparity increased 7-fold. And what this also does is it doesn't restrict all the ways super rich oligarchs can contribute to the political process. We know about unlimited independent expenditures through super PACs and the laundering of dark money through nonprofits, which pass them on to super PACs. But also this increases the amount of money that national party committees, they have 3 of them, the National Committee, the House Campaign Committee, and the Senate Campaign Committee can contribute to presidential campaigns from 5,000, which is the current limit, to 100 million. And rich people can give a lot to those party committees. It's over $100,000. So they can give over $300,000. This is a backdoor way of getting more fat cap money into the presidential campaigns. And then they have these victory funds, which are an innovation after the McCutcheon decision and after Citizens United 2010, McCutcheon in 2014, where they set up these joint campaign committees between the presidential campaign, the national party committees, and the state committees. So in the last election, rich folks could give over $620,000 to the Biden Victory Fund. I think the Trump Victory Fund came out at a little less than $500,000. So all these, ways that the super rich can keep pouring money into political campaigns remain untouched. So what you've got is a little public money that only the major party candidates can really get access to, on top of the whole big pile of crap, all that private money that's dominating the political system. So what we've been saying is progressives should demand that the campaign finance section be cut and we deal with campaign finance separately. Some people are saying because it's so bad that we just stop HR 1, but we don't want to say that because those voting rights are important. Otherwise, the Republicans are going to restrict them in a lot of states. And you start saying stop HR 1, you're going to anger all the civil rights and progressive groups that are pushing this bill. So we got to focus on the problem with the campaign finance while acknowledging the rest of the bill is good. So that's one thing. This bill will probably pass the House this week, and then it goes to the Senate. And there's a question of can they get it passed without Republican support? Can they do reconciliation? Can they limit the filibuster when it deals with bills dealing with political rights. Those are some of the options. And what I'm hearing is, the Democratic leadership is going to whip their members really hard to get this passed. So we may have a campaign finance system. They said they reformed and they didn't. So that's one issue that I think people need to look at. I wrote an article that appeared in Counterpunch last week called HR1's Campaign Finance Reform, a reform or campaign finance program, a reform that doesn't reform. And that goes into more detail what I just described. The other thing going on is the minimum wage. While the Senate may pull out all the stops to get HR1 passed, they're not doing that for the minimum wage. The Senate parliamentarian said you can't do budget reconciliation on the minimum wage. So Biden, Harris, and Schumer just said, okay. Now, Bernie Sanders is threatening to do a filibuster on that to get it back into the bill. We'll see where that goes. But I think what that tells us is the Democrats are willing to fight for a bill that'll make sure their people get to vote for them. But what are we voting for if we can't get a $15 minimum wage, which is still a poverty wage, and we won't get it for 5 years? It's phased in. If the minimum wage we had in 1968 had been increased in concert with inflation and productivity, it'd be over $24 an hour now. So, the Democrats really don't have a clue, most of them, about what working people are going through trying to live on these minimum wages, which is $7.25 unless you're a tipped worker, and then it's $2 and some change. And then you rely on those tips. And your employer is supposed to bring you up to the $7.25 if you don't get enough tips. But how many employers actually do that? There's so much wage theft going on in this country. It's billions and billions of dollars. So there's a whole lot of organizing and fighting we got to do around making sure when people work, they get paid a living wage. So, Angela, what's on your mind?
I have got a few things going on. First off, and I'm going to flip what I was going to talk about because I'll lift up our live stream on Saturday, which was amazing. My thoughts on that, I'll touch those last and segue into, what you're going to talk about. We want to celebrate the fact that our Green Party family in North Carolina, our Green Party folks in New Jersey are really going hard for the workers organizing, Amazon workers organizing in Bessemer, Alabama, which is a huge, huge deal. I shared something on my social media today about, supporting the strike. So if y'all follow me on Facebook, there's something I posted about that. And also, which is, I hope, that this is also something that's going to just catch fire, is Amazon workers in Iowa are also being organized by the Teamsters, Howie's Union, International Brotherhood of Teamsters, Local 238. Let me make sure I get it right. And they are organizing Amazon workers in Iowa. And hopefully Iowa will be joining the workers in Bessemer, Alabama, getting a union. So I'm pretty excited. Yeah, I know USA Today is not reliable, but unfortunately, that was the only place that's actually running this story. So, hey, sometimes you got to work with what you got. Big love to all of my Green family in the chat. Geda and Diana and Violet and Nadia, Ms. Leo, all of our family that joined us on Saturday for our live stream. And before I speak on that, what I was looking at when y'all were coming on is a strike that a whole lot of people may not know a whole lot about. And as you already know, this is a very, very, very sex worker friendly campaign. So I don't know if y'all know about the Portland stripper strike. They started it, I want to say last year during COVID. And what it is the fact that Black and Indigenous sex workers in Portland were not being treated equitably, as far as having access to work and things like that, access to, relief from COVID and things like that. So things have been happening. The Haymarket Poll Collective, if y'all are not following them, you want to be. And, just letting y'all know, and keeping up with what they're doing. But, the Oregon Health Authority recently awarded a nearly $600,000 COVID relief grant for Black and or Indigenous sex workers, as well as sex workers of color throughout the state. This is huge for me because these are folks who are not covered or have not traditionally been covered because they're not treated in the way that the rest of workers should be treated. They should be, being able to unionize and have the respect and have the access to resources that any other worker has. And that has not traditionally been the case. The fact that this has come about is the work of activists, that these workers made sure, they kept a presence in the streets, they kept a presence in places where they needed to be, and now things are moving. So we want to make sure that when we're talking about workers, we're talking about, and lifting up workers and their right to unionize. We're talking about all workers. We're not picking and choosing. We are talking about all workers. So, we're celebrating our workers that are doing the doggone thing and making Amazon do the right thing, pushing, for the workers' right to unionize, and also Haymarket Poll Collective. If y'all are not following Haymarket Poll Collective, you want to be, because they're pretty badass. Okay, and so to segue into, what Howie's going to follow up with, which is going to be dope, I want to thank all my Green family again. That was, most of y'all have joined us for all 4 of our Black History segments. I think, we had some very powerful people join us for those segments. I think that those discussions were absolutely amazing. And they will be continuing because we are here with African Liberation Month, and we all understand. And if you don't, you will. The African Liberation Month, is year round for us around here. So our last live stream, the one that we had Saturday, was with Sister Asante Wa and Nkrumah Ture, and our sister Robin Harris, both of whom are Greens and also members of other amazing organizations that are doing amazing work towards African liberation. And it was on imperialism in the diaspora. And so there was so much about, there are Latinx working for Latinx. You know what? I ain't got time for this. That's you don't know where you are. That's okay. Imperialism in the diaspora, and it was a necessary discussion. And so Howie is going to tie together for all of, his impressions on, all the things that we discussed about, because I think, February was a big month for some very deep and necessary discussion. So Howie, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the campaign team asked me to talk about what I learned about liberation from Black revolutionaries over the years. And for me, it really started in 1964 when I'm in California and I'm watching Ronald Reagan campaign against the fair housing law that just passed on behalf of the Republicans for a referendum to get it repealed. And I came up in a Republican family, and they said one of the things Republicans stood for was civil rights, but Reagan was making clear that was not the case. So the Democrats had a choice at Atlantic City at their convention to seat the Mississippi Freedom Democrats that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and Freedom Summer had organized, an integrated slate that actually followed the rules of the National Democratic Party, or the old regulars from the Dixiecrats, the all-white segregationist delegation. And Johnson decided to keep the South in his corner, because he's being challenged by Goldwater, who was mobilizing the white backlash, that he was going to seat the Dixiecrats, the segregationists. So I'm sitting here saying, well, where's my party? And I came into contact with, SNCC basically indirectly, because, the media and people like Reagan would say, oh, they're communists. And these young men that were our city rec directors, they supervised us at the community center when we played basketball and whatnot. They said, no, these are civil rights workers. They just got back from Mississippi. These are the people that organized the free speech movement in Berkeley. And that was about the right to organize on campus to go out and desegregate parts of the San Francisco Bay Area where restaurants and whatnot were segregated. And that's what that fight was all about. So, I became very aware of that. And one of the things that really struck me was, as I learned more about what happened in Atlantic City, the middle class leadership, including Martin Luther King, Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, who the year before had organized the March on Washington, which had a big impact, were telling the Freedom Democrats, accept Johnson's offer. You get 2 token seats. It's progress, and we'll make more progress in the future. And Fannie Lou Hamer, a sharecropper, who was one of the co-chairs of the delegation, because one of the things that SNCC did was everybody thought Bob Moses, this Harvard mathematician who was the lead organizer, would be, leading the Freedom Democrats. He said, no, this is for Mississippi folks, and you're going to elect your leadership. And one of the people they chose was Fannie Lou Hamer. And she persuaded the delegation that they didn't come all this way and do all they went through, getting beat up and fighting for the right to vote and organizing the whole party, going through the whole process, electing their delegates, to get denied. So she said we should reject, and she persuaded the delegation to reject that. And that summed up something I later learned that the African revolutionary in Guinea-Bissau, Amilcar Cabral, said. He said, tell no lies, claim no easy victories. You can't fool yourself. You can't call defeats victories. You got to be realistic about the current situation. So that was one of the things that the civil rights movement, with all they did, from the Montgomery bus boycott and all the fights for civil rights, the confrontation with the Democratic Party in Atlantic City in 1964, they inspired all the movements that came out of the 60s, the women's liberation movement, the gay liberation movement, the anti-war movement, the ecology movement. So that's another thing I learned, that a movement that has integrity and really fights for what it wants will inspire people who may not be directly affected by its concerns. And so I think that's one of the things I learned, that you have a movement that's principled and sticks by its guns. It's going to inspire other people to do the same thing and fight for what's right. So another thing going on at that time, which I learned about later when I read Malcolm X's biography and started reading his speeches, was, first of all, this man was so clear and sharp in his analysis. And I've talked to people that heard him speak in New York City, and they said they've never heard anybody that would, and he could speak to an audience. He could read an audience, if it was all black or it was a mixed audience or even white folks. He would know how to read them to get his points across without compromise, very clearly, so people had to deal with it. And what I thought, and I began to realize over the years he brought, was not just an analysis of racism, but of how racism was part of an international system of colonialism and imperialism, and that it had a class dimension. That just because somebody was black didn't mean they were for black liberation, because the system could co-opt people into being administrators of the system and getting rewarded for that. And so I'm going to talk about a speech Malcolm gave later when I talk about somebody else that influenced me. But he brought that class and race analysis, which also the year before 64, and I learned much more about this later, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. They had an economic bill of rights. And their analysis, and when I say they, I'm talking about A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, Martin Luther King was part of that. And Rustin and Randolph were leaders of the Socialist Party, which was a small party at that time, just a few thousand people. And they had a youth group, the Young People's Socialist League, the YPSLs. That's where Bernie Sanders got involved in politics in Chicago, civil rights politics in the 60s. And their analysis was to defeat this white backlash, which Goldwater was mobilizing as he ran for president, and the Dixiecrats were mobilizing and become manifest in George Wallace's campaigns in 68 and 72. You've got to have a program that appeals to the white working class too, to undermine the material basis for them getting mobilized around racist scapegoating, as if it was black people, not white employers, that were exploiting them. And to undermine this, what Du Bois called the psychological wages of white supremacy. You may be dirt poor, but at least you're not black. That's what white people were told. And so they tried to put forward a program that could also appeal beyond just the black community at the March on Washington. And they turned that into a freedom budget for all Americans. In 1966, they submitted to Congress. And there's a book called The Freedom Budget for All Americans by Paul LeBlanc and Michael Yates, which explains the thinking of Randolph and Rustin and the YPSLs about this race and class analysis and why they needed to put forward this economic Bill of Rights to undermine the material basis of racism in this country. And because we didn't do it back then and get this economic Bill of Rights, the white backlash got into the White House. Johnson kind of expressed that. Nixon clearly did. Reagan did. I mean, he announced his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, right where Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner were murdered as civil rights workers. And of course, with Donald Trump, you know, the white backlash took over the White House. And Trump was able to mobilize a lot of middle class and working class white people who feel that it's not corporations that move their jobs overseas, it's immigrants or something like that. And, you know, that's why this program was so important. And because we didn't get in the 60s, we're in the situation we are now, where the Republican Party is like the old Democratic Party that took over the Reconstruction governments, violently overthrew them back after the Civil War, with the slogan of, they were very upfront about it, white supremacy. That was their slogan. And here we are. They're a little bit more subtle now, but that's what the Republican Party is about today. So the other thing that happened in that period was, while Randolph and Rustin were silent about the escalation in Vietnam, King became very clear that we're losing the war on poverty and the war in Vietnam. And we can't get the freedom budget through Congress because they got to spend money on this stupid war. And he came out against the war. And that was one of the demands of the Poor People's Campaign, along with the Economic Bill of Rights. So that was another thing that I learned, that, you know, the international question, imperialism, cannot be divorced from dealing with domestic racism and poverty. And then the other thing they were doing in the Poor People's Campaign, which was a logical conclusion of what they're talking about in 1963 with the March on Washington, was King wanted to mobilize not just black folks, but poor white folks, poor Mexicans, American Indians, in a what later became Fred Hampton called a Rainbow Coalition. And that was something that I saw in the Bay Area coming up with the Black Panther Party. They were organizing black people, but they saw themselves as part of a larger movement, and they were trying to provide direction of the kind of organizing we needed to do at the grassroots. And, you know, a lot of people know about Bobby Seale and Fred Hampton, Huey Newton following the Oakland cops around with a law book and a shotgun, which they had the right to do, to make sure that people being stopped by the police weren't mistreated. That got a lot of attention. But what won the hearts and minds of the black community in Oakland was when in North Oakland, there was an elementary school called Salem Elementary. And there was an avenue going by there. There was no stoplight. And kids kept getting hit by cars. And the community had wanted a stoplight there. And the city council was not responsive. So the Panthers went out there with, rifles slung over the shoulder and started directing the traffic. And man, city council they had that stoplight pretty quick, and the cops were showing up. And the community said, hey, the Panthers can get things done. And that was the beginning of all those social programs that they were involved in: sickle cell anemia, free breakfast, escorting seniors when they got their checks cashed to the grocery store so they didn't get mugged on the way in or out. All these programs were not things that the Panthers thought of, in their central committee meeting. They had a storefront, and people would come in and say, here's the issues we got. And then the Panthers tried to respond. That's another lesson. You got to listen to the people to get direction as to how you organize. And of course, in Chicago, Fred Hampton, took that to another level. He, went out and made alliances with the Young Lords or the Brown Berets, I forget which, in the Mexican community would have been the Brown Berets. And the Young Patriots, which were basically Appalachian whites who'd been displaced down in Appalachia and were up in Chicago and facing similar problems as the Black community in terms of dealing with slumlords and discrimination in employment from, just from the neighborhoods these people were coming from. And so he was building, he called it the Rainbow Coalition. And, he did some other remarkable organizing. He got the big street gangs, the big three, LSD, the LSD Coalition, Lords, Stones, and Disciples, Vice Lords on the west side, Black Disciples on the south side, and Black Stone Rangers on the south side. And organized them to picket construction sites where Black people weren't being hired. And a lot of remarkable organizing going on. But the lesson there is you got to build a broad coalition of the exploited and oppressed to win your demands. And I think the Panthers exemplified that. And then the other revolutionaries that I did have direct contact with and discussions with were Jimmy or James Boggs and Grace Lee Boggs in Detroit. And they were proteges of C.L.R. James, the Trinidadian Marxist who wrote a lot of great books like The Black Jacobins about the Haitian Revolution, where the slaves threw the slave owners out and they formed a republic. They were elder advisors to SNCC activists and later the League of Black Revolutionary Workers in Detroit. And back in the early 60s, they organized what became one of Malcolm X's most famous speeches, The Message to the Grassroots, where he drew the distinction between what he called the Black Revolution and the Negro Revolution. The Black Revolution was about fundamental change to the system. The Negro Revolution was about just getting some Black folks into the existing system without changing the underlying structures that were keeping the masses poor. And he used what became something that a lot of people used for a long time, the difference between what he called the field Negro and the house Negro. So the field Negro, like Fannie Lou Hamer, the sharecropper, she had nothing to lose. Whereas some of those middle-class advisors back in 64 were telling her to take the compromise. And they had something to lose. So, Malcolm, that's part of the class analysis that he brought in. So the Boggs were right in the middle of all this movement. And, a couple of things that, Jimmy in particular gave me as advice that I've taken to heart. One is when you relate to Black political formations or Black activists, you got to be critical because there are a lot of people using that as a cover for their own effort to get a piece of the action, as Jimmy would put it. And so you've got to basically be, you got to be principled and expect people to be principled with you and have honest discussions. And if people aren't willing to have those discussions, they're probably not going to be reliable allies. And, you got to look for the people that really want to change the system to end the oppression and exploitation. So those are some of the lessons I've learned from directly and indirectly interacting with some of these Black revolutionaries. And I hope people found that edifying and helpful.
I mean, it was in the chat that somebody felt like you should be a professor of history, and Rose let them know you are a professor. You are a teacher of the masses. But I mean, like, how dope is it? Like, this is not some abstract thing that you read in a book. This is what you're sharing. This is your life. This is like lived experience.
And
I'm
it's
honored.
something a lot of people, my generation, the radicals, picked up from the same sources. And, the initial impetus was the civil rights or Black freedom movement in the South, which, changed a whole lot of things in this country. And yeah, I did go to college. I couldn't deal with academic culture. So too much backstabbing and ego puffing and, not enough, real intellectual work, frankly. It's got its own problems.
And one of the dopest things I want to insert to where you were making the point about what the Black Alliance for Peace and folks call the Blackness Leadership class. There was a podcast that, our boss is going to put it in the chat, I believe, but I listened to yesterday. I wanted to give a big shout out to Dr. Sharice Burden-Stelly because she brought that fire. And discussing the way that movements, as you mentioned, Howie, that movements get co-opted, that, we have to be, as revolutionaries, very, very aware and very, aware that co-optation happens, that all our skin folk ain't our kinfolk. You got some folks that are, heavily invested in the status quo and not interested in making sure that the masses of people get what they need. So that point hit me in my soul. It was good. I listened to this twice yesterday, so it's pretty badass. And Andy Messick, I'm gonna throw this out here because I want to hear you speak to this. I'd like to know what happened. Hey, Howie and Angela, what are your thoughts on Neera Tanden removing herself from her OMB nomination, and who would you like to see nominated instead?
Well, I think she removed herself because she can't get affirmed by the Senate. I mean, she was a Twitter warrior before Donald Trump got into it in politics. So she's made a lot of enemies, and she doesn't have friends on the Democratic progressive side either. When she was a Clinton supporter, she was one of the more nasty tweeters about Bernie Sanders. And when she found the time, Jill Stein, smearing her with this Russian asset nonsense. So Neera Tanden is learning that if you insult people and then you go for their approval, they ain't gonna approve of you. So I'm afraid, Biden will pick somebody like her. He will find a position for her in his administration that doesn't require Senate approval. And who would I like to see nominated instead? Man, I don't have much hope that the Biden administration, Office of Budget and Management is a policy formulation job. But I think of Robert Reich, who was the labor secretary under Clinton. And he served 4 years, and then he wrote a book about it. And it's titled Locked in the Cabinet. A progressive in that position is going to be very circumscribed. So I haven't really thought about who should be nominated in her place.
Hey, Sugarfoot. JS236. What's happening, baby? Question for Howie and Angela. Where can migrants around the world turn to for better treatment, protection, and aid? Is there any solution to this global crisis?
Well, actually, Germany provided the best treatment and protection and aid early on when there was, massive refugees from the Syrian civil war. But the right-wing backlash against immigration circumscribe that, and it's spreading across Europe. This is a huge crisis, and of course, Trump made it worse with the policies he implemented and the rhetoric he spouted. So where can migrants turn? Well, first of all, I think to, progressive forces that are there to defend them. And one of those forces are the Green parties of Europe. Of all the political tendencies, the Greens have been consistently defending immigrant rights. And that's one of the things that recommends the Greens. I think a lot of European Green parties are too conservative on economics and even foreign policy. But when it comes to defending immigrants, they're the only tendency that hasn't had an anti-immigrant wing, including, the left, Die Linke in Germany, a lot of the social democratic parties. There have been opportunists who have tried to pander to this anti-immigrant sentiment. At least the Greens in Europe have been consistent on that. So at this point, we need a movement to defend migrants, and it's going to become a bigger issue with climate change.
Mm-hmm.
John Kerry is on the National Security Committee I forget what they call him, the energy czar, the energy envoy, or the climate envoy to the world. But he came from a think tank called it's something zero. And when he got the appointment, they wrote a position paper saying, great, here's what we're going to do. We need to build more detention centers because there are going to be more climate refugees. And we need to up our military presence in the South China Sea and in the Arctic Ocean to compete with China and Russia for these resources. That militarized approach or response to climate change is exactly the opposite of what we need. So I'm not sure from this administration, we're going to get, some relief on, admitting asylum seekers and immigration, people seeking to immigrate, but it's not going to be at the scale it needs to be. And, of course, our position is everybody who's here should be legalized, given papers, have a path to citizenship like everybody else. I mean, they're proposing 8 years. Why not 5 years? Like for, legal immigrants who are documented. And we should move toward open borders because borders are a way to divide, working classes across borders and play them off against each other. So that's what Trump did. That's what employers do. They say, you want higher wages like these Amazon workers? Well, we'll just put the, fulfillment center right across the border in the maquiladoras if you don't accept your low wages here. They threaten to move. And that's how they use low wages in Mexico against workers here. And we should be able to organize across borders and raise everybody's wages to a high common standard.
Hey, is it Kenny Rosillo or Rosillo? Welcome. What are your thoughts on Texas removing the mask mandate rule? The first thing I think that I want to say to that is I want to speak to something that the wonderful folks over at Marshall's Plate, it's a trans podcast based in Texas, where they had a wonderful episode about what happened during the winter storms that came through there and the power outages and all of the ugly things that people had to say about the people of Texas, as if the people of Texas are their legislature. And so the first thing I want us to not do, because we're not jerks, is point fingers at Texas and go, oh, that's what you get. Understand that when you're talking about decisions that come out of the legislature, that's not necessarily the voice of most of the people in Texas. And it is certainly not the voice of the most marginalized people in Texas. So I don't want anybody that I know and love, follow, part of folks that are trashing folks in Texas. That said, I think that it is extremely unfortunate at a time when we are not seeing the rates of COVID infection are not going down the way that we need them to. And it's also my understanding, I need to read more into it, but also my understanding that and you can correct me on this, Howie, where all of the new strains of COVID that are showing up in Texas at a time when folks in power are deciding that people, leave it to the people. We're not going to mandate masks. That's not leadership. I'm sorry. That's not leadership. True leadership is taking care of your people. Yes, I understand there are people who disagree with the mask mandate and want to fight about it. I live in South Carolina. Diana and Gator, y'all know exactly what we're dealing with down here. This idea of personal freedom and American exceptionalism comes and bites us in the behind. But we need people to be safe. Leadership is making sure that even though you got a portion of the populace who doesn't want to do what you're asking them to do, for the greater good, we make sure that we take care of our people. And so as far as the leadership in Texas that decided that this was a good idea, that's not leadership. And I will tell them that to their faces. Howie, what do you think?
Governor Abbott doesn't care about the people. He's pandering to this far right, which has lost their minds. They were saying COVID is a hoax. They say climate change is a hoax. They say we don't need regulation of our grid. And look what that got them. They don't believe in evolution. I mean, the Texas, a lot of textbooks are made in Texas, and it's a big market for textbooks. So we have very conservative textbooks in this country because there's a commission in Texas that says what you can and cannot teach. So the power structure in Texas, which is basically the oil industry. I mean, there's another thing. They knew that oil was causing climate change back in the 50s. We have those documents. And they've been denying it ever since, spreading doubt. And Abbott is a creature of that. You don't care about the people. And to lift the mask mandate at this time, when public health officials say it's going to make more people sick and more people are going to die, it's unconscionable. It's inexcusable.
And also just thinking of the people that stand to get sick the most, we already know it's indigenous people, it's Latinx people, it's Black people, is people in the LGBTQIA plus community. It's those of us, it's people who are houseless. It's those of us who are the most marginalized. And I think that it bears thinking about that the people who make these decisions are not people who have to live with the decisions that they're making. These politicians are people who have the health care that they're denying us. These people have access to vaccines that they are denying us. So when you don't have to live with the consequences of the policies that you put out, you can be, these folks are very cavalier with other people's lives. And I think it's disgusting. And I think, yeah, Gene, that, this is a great way to kill poor people. I mean, hey, we're expendable, aren't we? People make me tired. Hey, Jonathan. Hey, Boo. Should the USA, to your earlier, I think this also speaks to your earlier question, Howie, about the world and, what's happening with immigrants also. Should the USA help with what's going on in Myanmar?
Yeah, I mean, the government has spoken out against the destruction of, elected government. And I think they're strengthening sanctions that already exist on some of the individuals responsible, which I think, those kind of sanctions are fine when they're calibrated to leadership, not on the whole country, which then the poor people suffer. And this is, unfortunately, the government, the elected government that was replaced, stood aside while this military went after the Rohingya and other Muslim groups and minorities in a predominantly Buddhist country. And so there are human rights violations all over the place. And what we can do is speak out and also boycott and encourage companies that are taking advantage of cheap labor under this military regime in Myanmar or Burma, as the U.S. still calls it. Myanmar is the military's name for it. Yeah, we should discourage companies and maybe sanction our own companies that are taking advantage of cheap labor under this military regime.
Oh, hey, I was reading a question in the chat. All right, Gia, if I butcher your name, just say so, because it's been a long day and I'm not trying to do it. So is it Gio Lehua or Lejua? Correct me. Hey, I don't know if y'all answered my question earlier because I had to do homework, but what is y'all opinions on Iraq bombing a U.S. airbase on January 8th? By the way, the question is for anybody to answer.
Yeah, Iran. And yeah, there was 3 bombings by Shia militias, which the Iranians influence sometimes fund. So there's plausible deniability on the part of the Iranian government. And this is part of an ongoing tit for tat. You know, Trump took out one of the generals who was a leader of these militias operating in Iraq and Syria. And so they responded with bombings. And we just responded last week by bombing a border crossing into Syria from Iraq. And this is an endless cycle. And it could sidetrack the negotiations to restore the Iran nuclear deal, which was, pardon me for the interruption.
You got an old school ringer, Howie.
Yeah, that was actually a green in Papua New Guinea.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that another time, but they actually got their first member of their parliament. A guy switched parties in Papua.
Oh, snap.
And so I'm going to try to help him, but he always seems to call when I'm on a live stream. So where was I? I was talking about
the bombing.
Oh yeah,
in Iran, excuse me.
Iran. Well,
Iran.
Iran was in Syria, or the U.S. bombing. The Iranian influenced Shia militias bombed U.S. assets in 3 places in Iraq, and you know, this is like a low level. They call them low intensity wars, and the way for us to get out of it is to get out of it. I mean, since we went into the Middle East, and people say, oh, it's after 9/11. No, no, no. We got in Afghanistan in 1978 before the Soviets and started backing Islamic fundamentalists like Osama bin Laden. We got into Iraq in the first Gulf War, 1991, and maintained a presence, a no-fly zone in much of the country, and sanctions that killed 500,000 children. And Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State under Clinton, was asked by Leslie Stahl in 60 Minutes, were those deaths worth it? And Madeleine Albright said they were. So this has been going on for generations now. And there are now more so-called terrorist groups than before, because if a foreign power comes in and is bombing you, destroying your infrastructure, making mistakes and blowing up wedding parties and so forth, you're going to want to get back at them. And you're going to, use what means you have. So the military is not the solution to these problems. There are definitely problems. There's massive corruption. There's sectarian strife, particularly religious but also nationality. The Kurds are oppressed. They're across 4 countries and nobody wants to give them their rights or cultural autonomy. Huge problems, but those can be better dealt with diplomatically and with the carrot of development aid. You know, there are parts of Afghanistan where the Taliban and the government aren't fighting, that are relatively peaceful. I mean, we could provide real development aid in those areas and say, if you guys would stop fighting, we can help you too. There's a lot we could do on the positive side. Basically, we need a Green New Deal for the Middle East. They got to get off oil. And as the rest of the world gets off oil, they won't have anything to sell because they're totally dependent on oil, or a lot of these countries are. So what's my opinion of the Iran bombing? I don't like the Iranians bombing the U.S. I don't like the U.S. bombing the Iranians. And the U.S., we can control what the U.S. does. Our demand should be get out of the Middle East as a military force and become a positive, constructive force.
Hey, Roberto Laredo. Question for Howie and Angela. Lately, I was reading about the Vienna public housing programs. Are you familiar with them? And what are your thoughts on doing a nationwide public housing program in the U.S.? Public housing was in our platform.
Right. And Vienna is a good example for the whole world. 60% of people living in Vienna are either in what they call social housing, what we call public housing, or cooperative housing, which means almost 2/3 of the housing market is not for profit, which means they provide affordable housing, and the for-profit sector's got to compete with those prices. So even the for-profit landlords can't jack up the rent to whatever the market will bear, because the market is controlled, dominated by the nonprofit sector. And so, when we put in our Green New Deal, the housing program, we're talking about building 25 million units of quality public housing over the next 10 years, 40% of which would be reserved for low-income people, which would make sure that the very low-income people that don't have access to affordable housing would. It would be mixed income, like it is in Vienna, where people of, professionals, blue-collar workers, as well as low-income people live in the same developments, which reduces race and class segregation, among other things. And this can be part of the Green New Deal in the sense that you build these units, link it to mass transportation, so you can have compact communities where work and shopping and residence and recreation are all in close proximity. Less need for personal cars to get everywhere. You can walk or bike or take public transportation. It's a central part of redesigning America for energy efficiency and sustainable renewable energy. So the public housing program, it's a job creator, it's an energy program, it's a desegregation program, and it's a program to build walkable communities. So, this is the only time the U.S. proposed building 25 million units of affordable housing was when the Fair Housing Law passed in '68. But unfortunately, the Democrats and Johnson, this was the early years of neoliberalism, where instead of doing it through the public sector as public housing, they were going to subsidize private development, so-called public-private partnerships, where the public pays and the private owners profit. And in the end, it didn't get built because Nixon came in and he didn't want affordable housing because the guy that was implementing that program, George Romney, Mitt's father, really was committed to desegregation, and Nixon wasn't. He was the white backlash in office. So Romney he got removed. And we never built that housing. But, we've talked about that scale in the past. Now, Bernie Sanders and AOC came up with a Green New Deal housing program, but all it does is rehab existing public housing for energy efficiency. And a lot of the other things public housing, because of all the neglect, is suffering from. Like in New York City, almost every public housing tenant has had periods when they didn't have heat in the winter. They got, roach and rat infestations. They got leaky roofs. They got elevators that don't work. I mean, they have tens of billions of dollars in repairs to do. So the Green New Deal housing program that Sanders and AOC put forward deals with one problem, but doesn't expand the public housing base, which needs to be, if we're going to have affordable housing for everybody that wants it. And it's on a scale where the private market has to compete with the public sector, and it brings down rents there too.
And it's like Jennifer Hyman, hey darling, was saying in the chat, also it's important to stop the privatization of existing public housing. And I've, seen things like that happen, in my home city in Milwaukee.
Well, and it's a big deal under the great liberal de Blasio in New York City. Because they can't get federal funding, they are inviting private investors in who get to manage public housing. And there are problems right now. They're supposed to remove, I guess it's lead from the water. And the agreement was when they took over, they would. But now the private investors, the private managers are reneging on that deal. And there's a fight going on right now in New York City over that. And that's what you get. They call it a public-private partnership. When you hear that, just think privatization. And so, yeah, it's a huge issue. And watch those liberal Democrats, because they're not fighting to tax the rich to fund public housing. They're fighting to give the rich more profit opportunities and take over public assets. And what they'll do is use those assets to squeeze them for all they're worth. And when they run them into the ground, they'll walk away.
Less than what did they used to call it? Benign neglect. This ain't benign neglect. It's absolutely malicious. Hey, Trent Allen, what are both of your and the Green Party's view on space travel? I'm about to say something snarky. You want to start off, Howie?
Yeah, I don't know if I can speak for the Green Party because I don't know what the platform says about it. But as far as I'm concerned, exploring space is something humanity should do. It should be done by international cooperation. Should be done through the public sector rather than by Bezos and Tesla and their counterparts in other countries. And a lot of it, most of it, should be unmanned. We have incredible devices like this one that just landed on Mars. And, putting human beings out there is more a PR thing than a scientific thing. And, eventually we may have people on Mars. We may have people back on the moon. But that shouldn't be the priority. The priority should be the scientific investigation.
Yeah, I was going to say, thinking about rich people who have speculated on colonization of other planets and the possibilities around that. Is like my hope is that any life on those planets has been watching what's happened here, and they already know the minute they get off them ships. But that's me. That's me being snarky. I'll be good. All right, we're getting the cane. So what are your final thoughts, Howie? There was a really dope question in the chat. I'm gonna see if I can't find it. But what are your thoughts?
Well, I keep going back to this idiot governor in Texas removing the mask mandate. I mean, the callousness toward the people is unbelievable. And what's even more frightening is the fact that, 74 million people voted for Trump, who lied to them for 4 years, who spreads, crazy ideas like, he actually won the 2020 election. And there are people that hang on to that. And that is a real problem. And I think, what we can do is provide real solutions to people's problems so they don't get off in this fantasy world of conspiracies and scapegoating people they don't even know. So, the Texas guy is a symptom of a deeper problem.
I agree. And the question, hey, Strong Flower, hey, darling, was asking if I was familiar with kratom. Now, I've heard of it. I don't know, I can't claim to know anything in depth about, what its use is or anything like that, but that it's used for, she's saying that it's used for various purposes from depression to physical pain, but it also has a questionable relationship with the medical industry. I've heard of it, but I can't speak on it with any authority. And being that, I get drug tested at my job, I'm scared to even try CBD. So yeah, it is what it is. Gotta love it. Yeah, so I think that and Gerda, yes, that is, we're going to be working on making sure that one of the people two of the people that I'm working on the resolutions that we are going to get passed through the Black Caucus and introduced to the larger body. Two of those folks are on here, both Robert and Jennifer are on here. And so Gerda is asking us to make sure that we are including the preservation of African cemeteries and burial grounds in our resolutions. So yes, we'll be working on that through the caucus and bringing it to the larger body. So I'm glad that you brought that up. And yeah, y'all gotta when will they legalize in South Carolina? Good question. And even when they legalize, people like me still won't be able to use because I have a safety sensitive job. So all of y'all that can, do it for me. And just stay safe. Like Howie and I say every week, and people think we sound like Jerry Springer, but we really don't. There is a pandemic. It's my understanding, and you can correct me, Howie, that those has the go ahead for $1,400 checks for the stimulus. Has that come? Did they okay that? So that's something else people can kind of look forward to give them some breathing space, or are they still just batting it around?
It passed the House. It's got to get through the Senate. And
Okay.
that's where they're going to use reconciliation. So
yeah,
their goal is to get it done in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, that's what I thought I read, but the article that I was reading, it was hazy as to whether they had passed it or not. But I say that to say, y'all just, yeah, I know, Rob, DOT is federal, can't smoke with a CDO. Don't I know it? That's why I'm so mean. But just stay safe as much as y'all can. And I mean, when we say that, we don't just mean your physical health. We also mean, keep your spirits lifted as much as you can. Enjoy things that make you happy and, things that bring beauty into your life. Those things are super important. So, we're not these compartmentalized beings. We're holistic beings. So, taking care of your mind, your body, your spirit, your environment as much as you can, because we need you. We can't do this work without you. So, and even more than that, we want you to be okay. It's that simple.